Daniel Pope is a professor emeritus from the University of Oregon and is here to tell us a unique story related to nuclear power in Eugene, Oregon. Thank you so much for being here with me today, Daniel. I really appreciate it. So, let's start with what happened in 1968.
Well, in 1968, as nuclear power was beginning to develop its commercial potential, or what people thought of as its commercial potential, um, our local public utility, the Eugene Water and Electric Board, commonly known as EWEB, got on the bandwagon and decided, um, under the influence of the regional power broker in the area, electrical power broker, the Bonneville Power Administration, that it would try to build a nuclear power plant in this county. Uh, and it went to the voters for approval, and in 1968, it won close to 80% approval from the voters. Um, Almost immediately afterwards, though, a group of people who were involved with or beginning to pay attention to the anti-nuclear power movement that was developing in the late 60s um, began to look into this and looked into various aspects of the problems that they felt that EWEB, the utility, was going to encounter, and some of the dangers that they really hadn't anticipated. They built an organization called the Eugene Future Power Committee and conducted a petition drive to put a ballot measure on up for a vote in 1970, less than 2 years after the approval, after the overwhelming approval, and they carried on a campaign against this nuclear power plant idea and won pretty decisively. I don't remember the exact number, but I think it was something like 57% against working on this power plant. And I believe, I'm not certain, but I believe it was the first time a community, through a ballot measure, through a public vote, had actually said no to nuclear power.
That's so interesting. And so this was kind of around the time in which America was kind of starting to get on board with nuclear power. Is that what was going on?
Yeah. The first nuclear power plant that actually produced power that got sold to users was back in, I think, 1956 in Pennsylvania, Shippingport, Pennsylvania, near Pittsburgh. Um, and the movement up to build nuclear power plants, um, I was going to say gathered steam, but that's the wrong metaphor, I think. Um, Although nuclear power ends up as steam power, it produces steam that turns a generator. Um, in the late 50s and the early 60s, it was promoted very hard by several companies that had committed to building reactors, construction industry companies that built the framework for nuclear power plants, um, and the federal government, the Atomic Energy Commission, um, kind of jointly. And in the early 60s, um, the companies, mostly General Electric and Westinghouse, um, essentially said, we will build you a nuclear plant, we'll show you how to use it, and then we will hand you the keys and you can run this thing. And they would sell it to utilities on that turnkey basis, as it was called. And these were basically kind of lost leaders for the nuclear power industry to say, we know how to do this and we're going to do it and come and get it. Um, to focus in a little more on the Northwest, the Pacific Northwest and Eugene, um, by the late 1960s, uh, power planners in this region were saying, we've run out of our unique resource, which was essentially the hydropower, the water power from the Columbia River and its tributaries. And we can't rely on the big dams anymore to generate all the power that we needed. We've got to find something else. We've got to build thermal power plants that generate electricity by heat rather than by water falling over dams. Um, and Bonneville in 1968 sponsored an organization that came up with a long-term plan that said the Pacific Northwest is going to need 20 large, really large thermal power plants by 1990 to meet anticipated demand growth. And this, they said, the best way to do it is to make the large majority of these 20 plants nuclear plants. It was certainly at that point the most ambitious nuclear project plan in the making. And essentially in 1968, EWEB, our local public utility, raised its hand and said, we can do it. We'll do one. And off they went. But they encountered the fact that there were people who were looking sideways at this and saying, not so fast there.
Yeah, and so some of the people that you actually mention in your article that was put in the Pacific Historical Review, you mentioned three people in particular, I believe. There was Jane Novak, Sheldon Novak, and then a fella named Chris Atteneve, I believe. So let's talk about some of the opposition to this nuclear power plant. Where did it come from?
Well, it was in the air to some extent. In the late 60s, there were a couple of books, there were a couple of reports that questioned the safety and the desirability of nuclear power. Jane Novick was the wife, not of Sheldon Novick, no relationship there, of a prominent scientist, Aaron Novick, at the University of Oregon. He had been at Los Alamos, and he was a dean, I think, by the time that the controversy erupted in the late 60s. And she had been an activist on environmental matters for a long time. And one of the things that she did was to get Aaron, her husband, involved in looking at the demand projections for electricity, because demand for electricity had been growing very rapidly in the post-World War II era. Utilities around the region had been building these big dams on the Columbia and Snake Rivers, and now there was no more space to build those dams. What were they going to do? Because they thought that that electric demand was going to grow by 7% a year, which means it would double every decade. And how do we match that? So that's how they came up with this plan for building these 20 thermal power plants. Aaron Novick took a glance at some of these numbers and suggested that there were other ways to manage demand, that there were things that could be done to reduce the rate of growth, and eliminate the need for a lot of these plants. And Jane Novick had encouraged him to do these studies and kind of picked up on that. And she had a lot of organizing experience and went to work on it. Um, Chris Atneve was a woman, incidentally, um, also the wife of a University of Oregon professor. Um, and I didn't really know her. I think I knew her by sight, but not by name. Um, and she was another one of the activists in the area. Sheldon Novick was not associated with the Northwest in particular, but he was one of the people who had kind of sounded the alarm about nuclear power. I think he was a physicist by training, I'm not sure, um, and had written a book. I think, can't remember the title offhand, but it may be called The Perils of the Peaceful Atom or something like that. And he was one of a handful of scientists who had begun to question the wisdom of investing heavily in nuclear power.
Yeah, and so what do you think spawned such a hostile reaction to nuclear power around that time?
Well, I think it was kind of there in embryo for a long time. And I think that's in the nature of nuclear power and the history of nuclear weaponry. The bomb had been dropped. This was now just a little more than 20 years after Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Um, it was really up to the proponents of nuclear power to show that this was something very different from the military uses of nuclear power, which during the Cold War, um, people were well aware of and well aware that the US and the Soviet Union could blow up the world. Excuse me.
No worries.
Um, so, throughout its history, the US Atomic Energy Commission and the companies that were involved in getting involved in electric generation through nuclear energy were in the business of showing, oh no, we're not at all like the forces that brought us the bomb. But in fact, they really were. So much of the civilian nuclear power industry came out of the military side of things. They had been involved in building plutonium production reactors for bombs. They had been involved in questions of delivery, safety, environmental effects of the military aspect. And in the public mind, I think it was pretty hard to say, oh, this has nothing to do with the forces that conceivably could blow up all of humanity. Well, I think that's the context for the growth of an anti-nuclear industry. And then there were some very real issues that had not been solved. Um, some of them were pretty specific and presumably pretty minor, like when eWeb started to plan out its site to build the plant, um, their first idea was to put it on Highway 99 north of the city, right near the airport. The nuclear cooling towers produce a lot of steam, produce a lot of fog, precisely in a place where in the winter our weather patterns produce an enormous amount of fog. The airport would have definitely suffered from this. Then they decided they wanted to put it on the coast, and a lot of people on the coast were worried that if they had a plant in mind, site in mind. It was going to mess up the landscape, mess up the tourist industry, um, potentially, um, waste disposal was an unsolved problem for nuclear power plants then, still is to some extent. Um, so there were these for quite specific issues that um, affected this particular plant just about the time that people nationally and internationally were beginning to say, let's take a second look at this and let's see what we're doing. And I think that points to one thing about the Future Power Committee's strategy and also its beliefs. Um, they did not say all nuclear power is bad, we never want to have a nuclear power plant. They said we'd better put a moratorium on it for our utility, and let's let's see how it develops. Let's see if it can be developed in a way that is safe and environmentally responsible and fitting to this area. Um, so they called for a moratorium. They used the slogan, "We can wait, we should wait," um, rather than "no nukes." Um, and I think it was, to some degree, quite sincere. I think that they were not unalterably opposed to all nuclear power. They were saying, let's see how it goes. Let's see if we can cope with the particular problems that we've identified. And let's see if we need it too.
Yeah, one thing that I find really fascinating about this story is it kind of reminds me of this more recent story out of Twin Falls, Idaho. In Twin Falls, a power plant was looking to build a bunch of windmills, and the citizens of counties from all over the state have really pushed in opposition against this project. It kind of sounds like a similar thing is going on here. What do you, how did, these three kind of opposition activists, how did they whip, these folks up into a frenzy? How did they do that? Today it's much easier to get your cause off the ground with Facebook and social media. What were some of the struggles you think, of getting of do you think it actually says something about the time period that people were able to band together so quickly in opposition to this project?
Yeah. Yeah, it did. And Eugene is also a place known as an activist area. It's a big university with a reputation of being active student body, liberal faculty. Um, Wall Street Journal at one point called Eugene the last refuge of the terminally hip, um, referring to the sort of hippie vibe that Eugene gave off. And it did. We moved here in 1975 after this event, and it was very obvious that a lot of people had congregated here because of countercultural kinds of issues and concerns and desires. Um, Still, to some extent, the case here, not quite as much as I'd like. uh, and uh, well, okay, where was I? Yeah, I think that kind of set the groundwork for the organizing that the Future Power Committee did. And they had scores of people, hundreds of people, I think, handing out leaflets, knocking on doors, writing op-ed articles. They're, they were quite, you know, active on the ground, grassroots for real. Um, Much of it came from university-related people, um, some from student body, but I think more from kind of environmentally concerned uh, professionals and people who'd been involved in environmental issues on other things. And remember, this is around the time of Earth Day in 1970, the first Earth Day, um, that uh, these issues kind of coalesced in people's minds. And the cost of saying, we can wait, let's have a moratorium, didn't seem very high. The power projections that Bonneville and eWeb had used to justify this big expense, it was supposed to cost, I think, something like $250 million back in the day when that was real money. Um, the cost of the plant seemed very high. The cost of waiting seemed negligible. So I think that was another selling point that really mattered in the community.
Yeah. Do you think eWeb kind of misread the moment or hurt their own ability to get this project off the ground? Because it seems like eWeb went into this with the idea that they were going to just kind of push this through and that they weren't going to get any resistance. Do you think they were a little surprised by the amount of resistance they ended up
I think
getting?
they were quite surprised. Um, I interviewed, I mentioned at the end of the article, a guy who had been the assistant head of eWeb in the years of this controversy, and then later became the head of eWeb. Um, and he was still mad 15, 20 years later at the Future Power Committee. You know, where did these people come from? We've been running this organization for decades. It's always been a good thing for the city and the area. Um, it's worth pointing out that in the late 60s and early 70s, public utilities in in the Northwest were producing the cheapest power in the United States, because hydropower is very cheap usually. Um, so, you know, Eugene Water and Electric Board had a very good reputation for the most part. Um, and I think they felt kind of blindsided by this um, anti-nukes movement. Um, at the end of it, I asked Keith Parks, the guy that I had interviewed about it, the guy from eWeb, um, how he felt about the result of the the project being blocked. And he said, they saved our butt. Because by the 1980s, he realized that nuclear power was an expensive, potentially dangerous, potentially environmentally damaging kind of project. And he had seen what attempts to build nuclear power plants in the region had come to. The Washington Public Power Supply System, an organization of utilities up in the state of Washington, had taken on the job of building 5 large nuclear power plants in the late 60s, early 70s. And they had ended up completing only one of them and defaulting on $2.25 billion worth of bonds that they had sold to finance. Um, that story is the eWeb story on a much larger and much more damaging scale.
Yeah, and so one thing that I find really fascinating about these types of movements is it seems like they always bring together groups that would seem in opposition to each other. So you've got these kind of activists, but you also mentioned that the agricultural community was not happy with this idea of bringing this power source to Eugene. So what was the farmers? What was their beef with the nuclear power plant?
Well, that if They were concerned. These are the farmers in the Willamette Valley, kind of north of Eugene, where the original siting plan had had the nuke being put out there near the airport, north of the city. The farmers there were worried that uh, the the vapor from the nuclear power cooling tower was going to, damage available sunlight, that there was going to be, radiation nearby that might affect their crops. Um, I don't think there was ever a very developed opposition, and um, the rest of the anti-nukes people kind of said, well, those farmers are just in it out of their own very specific concerns, and when the EWEB's plans veered over towards the coast, towards the Pacific coast, the farmers kind of dropped out of the movement. Um, so those were their concerns. EWEB tried to placate the farmers at one point. They had a couple of, I guess, physicists or agricultural experts talking about plans to use the warm water that had come out of the nuclear plant for irrigation, for a set of warm water irrigation for farmers that supposedly would be very beneficial for them. I think the farmers looked at that and said, not so fast. We're not interested in that. And I don't believe that that has ever been used in uh, wastewater from nuclear plants um, to irrigate crops.
Yeah, and so at a certain point, you have there's a character that enters your story. He's a reporter. Let me see if I can find his name real quick. But he writes a 14-page series about this power plant
Yeah,
here.
yeah.
What do you think his impact on the public's perception of this nuclear power plant was?
Well, this was in the Eugene Register Guard, our one daily newspaper, which at that point, I think activists on people on the left generally thought of as a kind of establishment newspaper. Was a locally owned, family owned newspaper, no longer less. Um, and I think people were quite pleasantly surprised in the anti-nukes movement that the Register Guard had come up with this very large scale, and my memory serves me correctly, quite thoroughly researched uh, set of articles about what this project would mean, and more generally about, what the future of nuclear power could be, should be, shouldn't be. So I think it was probably a fairly big influence on people's minds. Um, One thing I would say about the vote in 1970 that struck me when I did the research for this article, um, as I said back in 1968, very broad approval of this plan, um, close to 80%, I believe, in the whole city approved of it. In 1970, opposition to nuclear power was strongest in the precincts and in the districts that had voted most heavily in favor of it 2 years ago. These were mostly middle class, professional, often university adjacent um, districts. And I think in some ways this is a kind of a harbinger sign of the future for much of the environmental uh, and environmental movement that the uh, opposition to nuclear power was going to come from professional middle class kinds of circles, and that they were, on the one hand, eager to see Eugene grow and develop in 1968, but then they had paid attention to what the Future Power Committee and the Registered Art articles, et cetera, said, and had decided that this was going too far, too fast, and maybe going in the wrong direction.
Yeah. So, what got you interested in this story? What is it about? The characters that really kind of pushed back against this. What is it that makes it such a compelling story to you?
Well, for me, it was kind of a spin off from a book that I had started to work on about the Washington Public Power Supply System and its five nuclear power plants ideas and how the fiasco that it resulted in. Um, and in working on it, I had learned that right here in my hometown, in Eugene, there had been this um, debate and referendum on nuclear power back kind of at the beginning of the whole story about nuclear power in the Pacific Northwest. And then it turned out I was able to make contact with some of the people, talk to them about it, and things were relatively fresh in the 1980s about their memories of what they had done and why they had done it and what they had hoped to do. Um, and at the same time, they had, another decade and a half, 2 decades of experience of seeing the nuclear power industry nationally, worldwide, grow rapidly, but already after 3 Mile Island in particular in 1979, and then for other reasons, um, really faltered. And by the mid 80s, nuclear power was basically stagnant in the United States when I was doing that article, and how we got from the early enthusiasm and the early sense of this being what we desperately needed to um, that essentially the end of the nuclear dream by the late 80s. I thought was pretty interesting.
Yeah, and so as we kind of look back on this, in 2026, what do you think about the way, like, how should we interact with this history going forward? How do we use our knowledge of this to, move our society forward, continue to grow, that sort of thing?
Well, I think um, as as people have said, the nuclear revival is been talked about now for 30, 40 years. Hasn't happened, at least not in the United States and not in much of the rest of the world either. Um, People keep predicting it. I don't really see large scale nuclear power as a likely possibility in the future. Um, but there are a lot of people who remain or have become once again excited by that prospect. Um, Bill Gates, for example. Um, Even some of the anti-nuclear forces of the 20th century have become much more open to the idea of nuclear power because of climate change and fossil fuel, uh, the need to get off fossil fuel. Um, it seems to me that the situation now is kind of Um, how to put it? The calculations about nuclear power are, I think, more realistic. I think most people realize that solar and wind work a lot better, that it's still very expensive to build nuclear power plants, that there are unsolved problems. The Fukushima disaster in Japan of 2011, I think it was, is still pretty bright in people's memories. Um, there's been, I think, a revival of interest in the worst disaster of all, the Chernobyl disaster of 1986 in what is now the Ukraine. Um, so that I think even those who are proponents of nuclear power for future electrical demand growth um, have to be a little more cautious and a little less cheerleaders than they had been half a century ago. So I think, in a way, that's the triumph of the anti-nukes movement. But even more so, I think it's a triumph because of the failure of nuclear power to really solve electrical demand problems and really meet the needs of American people.
Excuse me. Thank you so much for your time, Daniel. I really appreciate it. If somebody liked what they were hearing from you today, where can they go to learn more?
Well, they're probably not going to have access to the Pacific Historical Review from 1990, which is where this article about the Eugene situation appears. But I have written a relatively brief and general article about the history of nuclear power in the United States for what I think is hoped to be a popular history magazine that Ohio State University puts out. I can't give you the citation offhand, but I can send it to you if you'd like.
That'd be great.
And more generally, to tell the truth, haven't kept up with the movement, either the pro-nukes or the anti-nukes movement, to the extent that I used to, but one of the joys of retirement. But, there is a lot of discussion about where nuclear power stands these days. And I think I am less opposed to nuclear power in general. I'm certainly willing to see the lifespan of existing nuclear power plants extended for another 10 or 20 years, which has been happening for the last couple of decades. But, read the papers, I guess, is what I would do if I wanted to keep up with the nuclear situation these days.
Well, thank you so much for your time today. I really appreciate it, and we'll have you back on the program again to talk about some different nuclear power plants at some point. Hey there, folks. Just a quick announcement. I am in the process of moving, and so the show will be on a very brief hiatus until after I have concluded the move, wherever that ends up being. As always, I appreciate those who continue to return and view the program, and we have lots of great stuff coming up, so thank you so much for your patience, and we'll talk to you soon. Good night!